There are as well two doctoral students with SICLe, Inam Ben Yahya and Aḥmad al-Hajjaj, who are developing their PhD research in Paris under Professor de Castilla's supervision. Another postdoctoral student, Marie-Ève Timiou, deals with issues related to digital humanities. I am the PI of SICLe, of course. Information on the project and the team is available on the Hypothesis website with SICLe. So if you look on the internet, you have immediately this. The Escorial collection is famous and its contents are known from the middle of the 18th century, thanks to Casseri's catalogue. But paradoxically, we know little about it. It was actually a surprise to discover the amount of information which could be retrieved from these manuscripts. But this came with a cost, namely the need to examine all the manuscripts of the collection. Now I will leave to Nuria the task of explaining how this library will reach the Escorial.
So it's very difficult to, well, thanks Sabine for inviting us to be here. It's very difficult to summarize a 5 years project in an hour, but we're going to try to share with you our most interesting findings from the study of the Saadian collection held at the Escorial Library. These and other results, as François has just said, will be published in the following months in a book coordinated by him, Bashir Taali, and myself, from the 3 countries implicated in this collection, which left a castle, which left a palace, to end up in another one, Morocco, France, and Spain. Our presentation of today will be divided in 4 sections, and each of us will expose them alternatively. I will start with a library in the sea. Paradoxically, the action of a traditional Moroccan scholar, Ibn Abi Mahalli, himself the author of treatises on jihad and fiercely opposed to the Spanish presidia on the Moroccan coast, was responsible for the presence in El-Escorial of the important library that belonged to the Saadian sultans. In February 1611, learning that his native town of Larache on the Atlantic coast of Morocco had just been given up to the Spanish a few months earlier, Ibn Abi Mahalli composed a poem lamenting the loss of the city, and then, a few days later, broke his calamus, thus symbolically renouncing his belonging to the caste of the people of the calamus, to gird up the sword and embark on a path of jihad. Nothing suggested that Ibn Abi Mahalli, a mystic who was also an apologist for tobacco, would lead his followers to such a rapid victory. In a few months, he swept the Sultanian troops from southern Morocco and reached Marrakech, the Saadian capital, in May 1612, which Sultan Moulay Zaidan had to abandon in a hurry. The latter's love of books, as evidenced by the annotations he made on some of those that belonged to him, certainly explains why he did not resign himself to abandoning his library in his Badi palace. Like his father, Aḥmad al-Manṣūr, who had brought the power of Saadian Morocco to his zenith after the so-called Battle of the Three Kings, which he had won in 1578, Moulay Zaidan was carefully to offer the image of a princess versed in the traditional sciences. His manuscripts were, in his eyes, a possession of the highest value, a treasure trove of knowledge that he did not want to part with. And rather than risk their falling into the hands of Ibn Abi Mahalli, he took them with him to Safi, a port on the Atlantic coast, from where he had conceived the plan to embark with his retinue southwards to the Sus, the southern region of Morocco, from which the dynasty derived its origin and where he hoped to rally his supporters. Two ships were anchored in Safi, a Dutchman and the Notre Dame de la Garde, whose captain, a Provençal called Jean-Philippe de Castellane, had just been appointed in 1610 by the King of France as a consul in Morocco. Moulay chartered them to keep his people and possessions safe. He himself took a place with his people on the Dutch ship, while the Notre Dame de la Garde was carrying his clothes and, above all, 73 large bales of Mohammedan books. The two ships headed south and, after a smooth crossing, dropped anchor in Agadir on 16 June 1612. The Sultan and his entourage returned to shore while the captain of the Notre Dame de la Garde waited to be paid the agreed 3,000 ducats. The days passed, but the Sultan's initial commitments failed to materialize. The latter was in fact unable to settle his debt. For his part, Castellane weighed up the risks he faced. By giving in to Moulay-Zaydan's demands and unloading his cargo, he was very much afraid of being left with a debt that would never be honored. The very uncertain position in which the Moroccan sovereign was now, moreover, suggested that it would be difficult for him to react effectively to recover his goods. From what Castellane knew of the situation, the Sultan might even never resume his position. So, the captain decided to weigh anchor and set sail for Marseille, where he hoped to place everything in the hands of the governor of province, who may have instructed the captain before he set sail for Morocco. It seems likely, however, that his plan was to sell the cargo to the highest bidder. Castellane surreptitiously set sail with the agreement of his crew on the night of 22 June 1612. This journey northwards seems to Castellane to be the least risky solution, the only risk being the corsairs active in the Mediterranean from the Algerian coast. However, he did not count on an unforeseen event. Contrary winds delayed the Notre Dame de la Garde so much that 3 vessels of the Spanish fleet of Admiral Luis Fajardo, under the command of Juan de Lara, chased it off Salé and boarded it, even though France was at peace with Spain at that time. Why this capture, which was contrary to the principles of law? Had the Spaniards been informed that the French ship was carrying Moulay-Zaydan's treasures? Or did they consider any ship encountered in Moroccan waters as hostile, since Spain was in conflict with the various parties who had then divided Morocco between them? We don't know, but Lara showed his respect for the good relations that had been established between his master and the French king by refraining from torturing the French sailors to extract their confessions when interrogating them. The Notre Dame de la Garde was taken to Spain and its cargo disembarked in Lisbon, in a country in which Philip III issued shortly before a decree expelling the last Muslims living in the Iberian Peninsula, and where the possession of books in Arabic was likely to earn their owner the keen interest of the Inquisition. Moulay-Zaydan's books seemed destined to be devoured by the flames of a fire, as was said to be the case with those seized in Granada in the aftermath of the city's capture in 1492. This was not the case, however, as the manuscripts were taken first to Madrid and then to the palace monastery of San Lorenzo del Escorial, where the Royal Library and the first collection of Arabic manuscripts were kept. The captain and sailors of the Notre Dame de la Garde were less fortunate. They were imprisoned in Cadix, pending a trial that would decide their fate. This was sealed on 23rd October 1612. The master and the foreman were sentenced to death, Castellan and the rest of the crew to galleys. They appealed. What can we say about the part of the cargo that interests us most, the collection of books that had just been seized by the Spaniards? The earliest evidence of this is provided by Francisco de Gurmendi, criado of Philip III, who was commissioned to make an initial assessment because of his knowledge of Arabic. In a letter to the king, he wrote that there were about 4,000 books, the majority of which had no title and more than 500 of which had no binding. Baltasar Torreño said that there were 3,000 books. The number, however, increases rapidly from 700 to 800, according to information given by Thomas Orpenius around 1613, by Moulay Zaidan's envoy to the Netherlands, Aḥmad al-Jazuli to 20,000 in 1692, according to the claims of the Moroccan ambassador to England, reported by the Oxford professor of Arabic, Thomas Hyde. The value of the collection also changed. During the complex negotiation that followed the capture of the library, the Sultan seems to have made proposals to persuade the Spaniards to return his books. In a letter of 9 July 1615, the French ambassador in Madrid refers to an exchange of Christian slaves for the library, in which Moulay Zaidan offers them 4,000 or 5,000 crowns worth of Christian slave for these books, and so on. For wanting to prevent his books from falling into the hands of Ibn Abi Mahalli, Moulay Zaidan had led them to be captured by his fiercest enemy. Lacking direct diplomatic contact with the two powers involved in the affair, France and Spain, he sent an embassy to Constantinople to gain Ottoman support. The affair caused a stir on the shores of the Bosphorus, as Achir Arlet de Saint-Cy, then French ambassador to the Sublime Porte, heard about it and echoed it in his correspondence. The sympathy of the Ottomans was a comfort to the Moroccan Sultan, but a more direct and effective way had to be found to obtain the return of the books. This was offered to him by the United Provinces, which had relatively constant diplomatic and commercial ties with Saadian Morocco. A delegation composed by Qaid and Eunuch, assisted by a Moroccan Jew familiar with these missions, was therefore sent to Amsterdam to obtain from the Dutch, through their ambassador in Paris, a safe conduct in favor of the Qaid, so he could plead his master's cause. France was unwittingly placed in a delicate situation. Castellan was its consul in Morocco, but the court refused to admit this to avoid the risk of finding itself directly involved in this diplomatic imbroglio. For the Saadian sovereign, however, it was clear that France had to answer for the dishonest conduct of its representative. The loss of these books affected Moulay Zaidan greatly. In order to put pressure on the King of France, whom he held responsible for the situation, but perhaps to satisfy a need for revenge, he had all the French nationals who were then in Morocco imprisoned. For 2 years, trade ceased between Morocco and France, and relations between the two countries did not resume until much later, in 1631. Castellan had had time to reflect on the implications of taking risks. In the Cadiz jail, where he was waiting to find out whether he would go on Spanish king's galleys, he would have taken little comfort from Louis XIII words about him, who says about him, "He is a faithless man who was never our ambassador nor recommended by us in any way. He is a perfidious person whom he would have punished." We know nothing of Castellan's end, who died in 1619 at the latest. Ibn Abi Mahalli, who had traded the calamus for its word, perished in 1613 in a battle. Moulay Zaidan returned to Marrakech, where he ruled until 1628, but his power was weakened and his books were now part of the library of a Christian ruler, which they were not to leave. 4 centuries and many more kings later, the books of the Saadian sultans coexist in peace with those of their arch enemies, Philip II and Philip III, in the library of the monastery of Escorial, 70 kilometers far from Madrid, in the midst of the nature and sometimes of the snow. At the end of a narrow, dark corridor, a beautiful crafted wood door leads to this marvelous collection of Arabic manuscripts, which was one of the most important in Europe in the 17th century. Today, thanks to its preservation in its almost original state, with the exception of the consequence of a fire in 1671, the collection is the only material evidence we have today to understand the concept of a library in the Arab Muslim world in the modern age.
Okay, so as you have understood from what Nouria has been saying, in the Escorial we have the Sardian collection, but also the Spanish collection started with Philip II. So one of the problems we had was to disentangle the two collections and make sure that we were dealing with the Saadian collection itself. We have kind words by Lévi Provençal, who wrote the part of the catalogue started by Derimbault, about the fact that there is an ex libris of the sultans on almost every first folio, but it's not the case. But when you find one, you may find something very interesting, like this one, the ex libris of Zaidan, who was still a prince when he had it written on the book. But as you see, it's written in Nastaliq, which is quite unexpected. We have actually found that the Saadian collection is not the result of the work, the collection by Aḥmad al-Manṣūr and his son Moulay Zaidan, but it's actually made of various libraries from the princes and from the sultans. Aḥmad al-Manṣūr started to collect, and we were fortunate to find at least 2 manuscripts with his ex libris as the one you see now. When he became sultan, his way of indicating that he was the owner of the manuscript became sometimes very visible, like on this first folio where you have here. Okay, so I will show you this very surprising ex libris in Nastaliq, which I alluded to. Then the first ex libris of Aḥmad al-Manṣūr, and this example of one of the books which were part of Aḥmad al-Manṣūr's collection, with the stamp with the alama on it, and vertically the ownership statement of Aḥmad al-Manṣūr. In many cases, we find this situation where the ink has been sprinkled with gold in order to enhance its value. Of course, It has to do with the fact that Aḥmad al-Manṣūr was called al-Dhahabi, the golden one, but his sons also were keen on having gold on their signature. On all the ex-libris, we find the Abdallah formula at the beginning of the ex-libris, and sometimes we have also Wali, the next thing. These are part of a common repertory of Aḥmad al-Manṣūr and his sons. This is another example without gold, but still showing, and you see in this case that you find again Abdallah, but al-Mutawakkil alayhi, and so on and so forth. So there is a certain variety of the formulas you find in the ex-libris. A very interesting discovery was the fact that his son Abu Faris, who became sultan in 1603 and lasted 6 years before he was assassinated. He was a competitor to his brother Moulay Zaidan. Abu Faris also collected books from an early time. Here he was still a prince, and it's the only ex-libris where we find a date, Rajab 999, which is April 1591. It's certainly not the date when he started collecting books, but it shows that he was active at that moment. He has way of writing his ex-libris, which depends on the place on the book, but he is very keen on having them written vertically, as you can see here, where he wrote these 2 lines on the side of the illumination. Then you find a larger variety of appellatives for Abu Faris. He is again like his father, Abdallah Walihi, but he also has a variety of names. Here is still a prince, so you see that he is Ibn Amir al-Mu'minin, and this ex-libris is interesting because it's one of the few ones where he gives the name of his father. Usually he uses either the title Amir al-Mu'minin or its general al-Khulafa al-Rashidin, so without giving the names of his father, grandfather, and so on. On this other example, we have exactly what I was saying here. You see that it's in the plural without giving the detail of the names of his forefather. The formulas used by Abu Faris can be rather extensive and occupy various lines, as you can see here. Well, so it's also this is now the turn of Moulay Zaidan. I cannot see because it's hidden by the images on the side, but his name is at the beginning of the first line. Here is still a prince, and we will discover how things were working. So we have very few cases where 2 names are present on the first page of a manuscript. Here is the case. We have the indication on the top of the ownership by Aḥmad al-Manṣūr on the first line, and on the next one, according to a formula which is very common on books, it is said that the book then went to the ownership of Moulay Zaidan, who was now a sultan. So we find this kind of situation, which is rather normal. When we are dealing with his brother, things are somewhat different. Apparently, he took over the books of Abu Faris, and we have this kind of first page where you have here in the upper part the ownership statement by Moulay Zaidan, and on the left side, vertically written, the 4 lines of Abu Faris' statement. So it seemed that the two went well together. Actually, there is only a few examples where, like this one, the name of Abu Faris was erased and replaced by the name of Zaidan on the first line, at the end of the first line. But, and this is very, very interesting, we found also cases where we have first the name of Abu Faris here on the top of the picture, but you see that we have also the formula which we found earlier stating that the book went to the ownership of his brother, Zaidan, but we have a commentary here. It's not only an ownership statement, it's also kind of explanation of why Abu Faris lost the books, because he, well, they were taken from the book. Actually, I translate quickly what is written here. The book went by the effect of the sword and the spear from the hands of the one whose name is quoted above, because he didn't fulfill his duties of preserving the caliphate, and so the book went in the hand of Zaidan. So we have some statements by the hand of Moulay Zaidan which show that there was still some resentment. And we have actually another text which is currently under study by Dr. Zouihal, which is very long, and Zaidan expresses his revenge on his brother, and even describes the circumstances in which he succeeded in taking again the books. Then we have also another first folio of a manuscript. This, the book was in the possession of another Sharif Hassani, who wrote, as you can see in the upper part of the page, his name is ex libris, and below in brownish ink, you have the answer of Moulay Zaidan, who says that actually the books were taken from him in a very unjust way, and that the man was actually not worthy of anything. So when you look at the titles used by Moulay Zaidan, you see that he is also using more frequently the name of his father. I won't go into a kind of Freudian analysis of the way of the behavior of the two sultans, I mean Abu Faris and Zaidan, with respect to their father, but it's very interesting that they have not at all the same attitude towards the Aḥmad al-Manṣūr. Here, last example to show the one marked by Zaidan, and the use of gold by him on the last example. So I come to this last slide with a kind of recapitulation of the situation. As you can see, we have almost as many manuscripts which were part of Aḥmad al-Manṣūr's collection and those which belong to Abu Faris. And this is very surprising, because actually when I started, I thought that I would find a lot more examples of ex libris by Aḥmad al-Manṣūr, but it's not the case. We have mostly ex libris by Moulay Zaidan, which is obvious because he was the last owner of the library. But you will note that it's not covering at all the dimension of the collection. We have almost 2,000 manuscripts, and you see that we have not even 300 ex libris by the Saadians. So it means that we had also to take into account other elements in order to go back to the original situation of the library and understand what was part of it and not part of the Spanish earlier collection. So now I will leave the floor to Nuria.
And in this part, we are going to speak about the bindings. The manuscripts of the Saadian sultans are not bound as they were at the time of the library's capture. In fact, we don't know what condition they were in when they entered the Spanish royal collections at the beginning of the 17th century. I have already mentioned the information provided by Francisco de Gurmendi, who at the time the library passed into Spanish hands, noted that more than 500 manuscripts had no binding. But very quickly, as we have seen, a speculation on the number of manuscripts and their value developed, and bindings did not escape this state of affairs. After the manuscripts were incorporated into the library of Philip III, the Escorial workshops intervened on various occasions and in different ways, sometimes to bind volumes that were not bound, and sometimes to restore or replace the bindings as early as the 17th century and until the 19th century. What we have done in the frame of this project is to examine the development of bookbinding in Morocco from the Middle Ages until the early 17th centuries, based on the bindings of the Sultan's collection kept in the Royal Monastery of San Lorenzo del Escorial. There are two conclusions we wanted to bring here. On the one hand, how the Saadian collection shows the traditional aesthetic and techniques of Moroccan bookbindings at the beginning of the 16th century and even slightly later, when their decoration was still based on the use of small tools and gilding, in line with the medieval Islamic tradition also known in the East, but with local peculiarities. On the other hand, we have identified how the Ottoman influence succeeded in transforming the traditional crafts by the end of the 16th century and early 17th centuries and taking durably roots in Morocco. In addition to the study of the workshops active over the period, the comparison between the specimens of the two techniques help understanding various issues. The chronology of the changes that bookbinding was undergoing at the time of at that time, or the possibility of regional traditions or a sociology of Moroccan book owners in Saadian times. In the 17th century, As-Sufyani wrote a treatise on bookbinding in which he defined three kinds of bindings in use in Morocco in this time. Among the first ones, in the Hispano-Moorish style, produced with small tools and gilds, a number of them in the Escorial collection had attracted our attention because they formally diverged by the structure of their decoration from what is well-established tradition in the Muslim world since the 12th century probably. From this date, bookbinders began to draw an octagonal shaped field to accommodate the central ornament instead of the previous rectangular field. In addition to the frame, the decoration itself is highly coherent. The central ornament is constituted by an interlace which can take various forms. but its basic geometrical shape is constituted by a square standing on the tip. The interlace is actually a very old component of the binding decorations, since it appears on Quranic bindings of the 9th century with the characteristic decoration of a caterpillar. With the passing of time, the tools used to produce this decoration have evolved. Whereas at the beginning it was a tool with 2 or 4 teeth whose repetition produced this pattern, the interlace effect being enhanced by the impression of fillets on both sides, the binders generally jointly used later 2 small tools. As it's generally the case in the Muslim world in medieval times, binders have only a limited toolkit at hand. The relationship between the manuscript and the volume it protects has to be approached with caution. 2 fundamental questions arise, that of the place of production of the binding and that of its date. The first is undoubtedly the one which can be most easily answered. On the basis of the examination of the scripts, it turns out that 33 manuscripts which present this kind of binding were copied in the western part of the Muslim world. The remaining 5 were transcribed in an oriental type of script, but were in Morocco at the beginning of the 17th century. We cannot absolutely exclude that the latter were bound in the eastern part of the Islamic world, but this seems highly unlikely. My hypothesis is that the bindings were produced within the area where Maghrebi script was in use, that is to say, the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus until the end of the 15th century, and North Africa. The origin of the collection suggests to narrow the possibilities to Morocco, but data about the origin of the manuscripts is scarce. Regarding the chronology of this group of manuscripts, the oldest copy was completed in 594, end of the 12th century, and the most recent one after 994 and 94. In other words, they cover a time span of 4 centuries. However, the date of completion of the oldest copies is not of much use, as it is highly probable that their present binding is the result of a replacement, the date of which is difficult to ascertain. In some cases, the similarities between an old binding and a more recent one provides a clear answer. A copy dated in 714 was produced in the same workshop as this one, completed in 920. For this reason, the period of production of these bindings extends from the second half of the 14th century to the end of the 16th century. For the first time in the study of Islamic bindings, we could identify a workshop that was not working for a princely collection. And here we are thinking a specific case of the Ottoman Sultan's library in Istanbul. 5 items could have been produced over the second and third decade of the 16th century in the same workshop. The same tools have been used to produce all of them. On the basis of the study of Nice Maghrebi manuscripts in the Escorial collection produced in Fez on 969, it was clear that traditional Maghrebi techniques, notably interlace, were still alive in the 3rd quarter of the 16th century. Towards the same date, other Maghrebi copies were covered by bindings decorated with plates almost identical with those used by binders working in the Ottoman Empire towards the same period. Of course, it may be the manuscripts were brought from Morocco to the east and bound there. But this seems hardly to be the case, since the items we have collected are part of the library of the Moroccan Sultan Moulay Zaidan, kept today in San Lorenzo del Escorial, it means that they were in Marrakesh in 1612. The bindings in Ottoman style are decorated with a central mandorla and eventually also with four corner pieces, these 5 components being stamped with plates. This technique, originating in the eastern part of the Islamic world, met with tremendous success as it allowed for a quick decoration of the fields. It also reduces the variations as the decoration made with a plate will be almost exactly the same on various bindings, which is not the case with the small tools. There may have been some reluctance in Morocco to import wholesale the Ottoman fashion or the need to have cheaper plates than those imported from Constantinople, leading to the introduction of local imitations of the mandorla plates, engraved with a pattern that does not follow the very stable Ottoman premonitory, but interprets its compositions. In general, the plates gradually supersede the traditional bindings with a decoration made with small tools. I would like to show you an example of a fantastic Ottoman binding covering a manuscript in Maghrebi script. It was transcribed in a Maghrebi hand in 1018 and bound in Ottoman style. Obviously, there was no time to have the copy traveling back and forth between Morocco and the Ottoman Empire, between a Moroccan copyist and an Ottoman binder, during the short span of time between the completion of the copy in 1609 and the seizure of the library in 1612. The leather has very unusual red and green stains everywhere. And now I showed you an example of a manuscript in Maghrebi script too, with a binding which imitates the Ottoman style, especially visible in the treatment of the mandorla and the 4 corner pieces, both technical and decorative aspects. Or this one, where the binder shows that he did not clearly understand the model. Can the chronology shed light on this change? On the basis of the evidence collected so far, the earliest instance of the use of an Ottoman plate on a binding prepared by a Moroccan binder predates by only 1 year this binding, decorated by a plate produced in Morocco. Only 1 year. If this finding mirrors correctly the sequence of events, the importation of plates preceded the local production, as one might expect. This also means that the importation of bound books from the Ottoman Empire, although important during the 16th century, at most made Moroccan book collectors acquainted with these new aesthetics, but was not instrumental in the development of a local production inspired by this model. The Escorial collection throws a completely new light on the history of binding in Morocco during the 16th century. It shows the decline of the traditional bindings with an ornament made with small tools, replaced by a new style inspired by Ottoman models and a technique that was already well known in the Ottoman Empire. It reflects both the strength of a specific tradition that permitted the book craftsmen, from the most modest to those who worked for the palace. However, there is little doubt that the latter imposed new aesthetics that were to leave a lasting imprint on the art of the book in Morocco. These aesthetics clearly reflect the dynasty openness to the wider world. It is difficult to evaluate the changes with regard to the East in general due to the lack of previous studies that would propose an assessment of the changes in the field of book production. The book binding has the advantage of offering a clear break, both technically and aesthetically, with the previous local tradition. It reveals the impact of the Ottoman culture on Saadian Morocco. This was reflected both in the reworking of decorations and in the production of local imitations. However, the interest in contemporary Spain cannot be overlooked either. The only painted manuscript in the Saadian collection is clearly influenced by Iberian models. More surprising is the binding of these Arabic manuscripts, which contrasts with the rest of the contemporary production and reminds one of the black and red bindings of a contemporary Spanish bibliophile, Diego Hurtado de Mendoza. In this case, however, two pieces of leather of different colors come into contact with each other in the middle of the spine, a process not unknown to bookbinders in the Muslim world, but not the one used for the previous example.
So the collection is very interesting for it's the only case I know where we can follow the history of the building of a library. Buying books in this period of time, of course, was not as easy as it may be today. One of the ways we were when the possibilities were, of course, to have manuscripts compiled, but it seemed that the Saadian were not using this possibility so much. They actually bought most of the books, and they bought them in the East. It was, of course, a complicated matter because they had to build a kind of network of connection with people living in the East, mainly in Egypt, in order to have access to the people who were selling books. Of course, it was often following the death of a scholar, when his library was sold by his heirs, that it was possible to get some books. And, well, you had to be there or to have someone was able to find these books. So we know by the Sardian letters, collection of letters written by the Sardian sultans, that they were cultivating friendships and trying to relate with scholars in Egypt, but also with official authorities, in order to have the possibility to buy books. We have, for example, this man, Yahya al-Mallah, who seems to have been very important in this trade, because we find various names, various manuscripts with his name on it. And this leads to the idea that the study of the collection provides the possibility to define what we would name micro-libraries, that is to say, a set of books which were once part of a library before entering that of the Saadians. Buying books was, of course, a possibility. It seemed that sometimes it was a gift. The note in the upper part of this slide showed that the book was, as says the note, presented to Abu Faris for his library. Maybe it was an interested gift that the man who gave the book actually wanted some money in exchange. But anyhow, there was a kind of active research of Saadian buyers from the part of people living in Cairo. Then we have, of course, another market which is less important in terms of numbers, which is in Morocco. And we find, again, this same kind of feature, I mean, micro-libraries, like the few manuscripts which were part of the collection of Aḥmad al-Manṣūr, the famous scholar of the end of the 15th and early 16th century, who had a very nice signature. You can see it here. And so, well, and this is actually a problem we had in reading some of the signature by Moroccan scholars or owners, because, well, they are somewhat difficult to decipher. And then another scholar who was important for Aḥmad al-Manṣūr is Aḥmad al-Manṣūr. He gave to Aḥmad al-Manṣūr 3 ijaza, and you have here an example of the ijaza. So the book, which was part of the collection, was given to the Sultan with the ijaza, but we have also manuscripts, 2 of them, which were written by him and enter later in the Sultan's library. In some cases, I mentioned this Yahya al-Mallah. It seems that there were some interaction with other people. Here you see that his name is on the top of the picture, but below you have an ownership statement by Maghribi hand by someone who styles himself Azuz al-Wazghiti, and this man was a hajib of Aḥmad al-Manṣūr. So it seems that the process of buying books in the East was also used by some of the people close to the palace to get books for themselves. A second very interesting point in the study of the Saadian collection is the fact that we found a lot of prices which are really important because they are dated. They are dated between the moments of the latest manuscripts where we find these prices and the date of 1612, which is of course the end of the library. So we have prices which can be reflect really the situation on the book market in Cairo at that time. We have 2 sets of prices, one in dinar, in 2 hands, above Maghribi hands and below Oriental hands. And it's, well, they can be actually the equivalent of the next prices, which are in sultani, that is to say, the gold, the Ottoman gold coin. They can be the equivalent because we have one note where it is stated that it's a dinar sultani. So all these were part of the system of buying books. Here you have 4 examples of the hands which were found on the manuscript. It seems that they may correspond to a kind of batch of books bought at a specific moment and then sent to Morocco to reach the collection of the Sultan. We have tried to understand those prices, and we, well, they are partly in sultani, so it's always sultani wa and another silver coin, which is called Osmani, which is the akçe. So we have converted the prices in akçe, so it's a vertical element, and we try to find a kind of an index relying on the materiality of the book in terms of paper. We know that the paper is the most important component of the price of the book in this period. And you see that with the exception of a few prices in the upper part, which are clearly out of this general trend, we have somewhat of a trend in the pricing of the books during this period of time. Then, of course, the text offers some glimpses into codicology. For example, in one of the manuscripts, it's the copyist says that he is Kahad, producer of paper, and we were actually able to find at least 4 manuscripts which were produced in Morocco and with a local paper, which means that at that moment when in principle the production of paper has stopped in Morocco, there was still a production. And what is interesting is that all the manuscripts were produced for the Sultan. In addition to that, you notice that there are two patches on the paper, and it seemed that they were pasted over the paper before the scribe started to write. That is to say that the sheet of paper was not perfect, but with a little trick, they succeeded in making it usable for the copy of a manuscript. In many manuscripts, we find tables of equivalence between various systems of numbers with a strong interest for Farsi numbers. We have equivalent between Abjad Farsi, between Farsi and Khubari numbers. So this is also, these notes are important because they show that people were keen on this very specific way of giving numbers. We found also this little poem. It's an ink receipt, and it's very interesting because we have few, to tell the truth, few analyses of the ink made, and we found that they are usually combining metallogallic and carbon ink. And it's interesting because the receipt, which is slightly earlier, it's end of the 15th century, the manuscript is the end of the 15th century, so the receipt must be between time and Saadian times. The receipt is completely in accordance with what we found on with the analysis of the inks. Then, of course, working on the whole collection, you come across things which look alike. For example, title pages. We have these two title pages, which are obviously depending on the same prototype. They were perhaps part of the same collection, or they were prepared by the same workshop. We don't know, but still it's interesting to see how things come and group together when we study the collection in this way. Also very interesting are the titles written on the side of the book according to the common Muslim tradition. You have here three examples. On the bottom, you see an example in Maghribi calligraphy with a few ornaments. Then a book with a Nastaliq title, and the third one is, well, Oriental, perhaps Nastali. But what is very interesting is that all these books were written during the Saadian period in Maghribi script, which means that there was either someone who was able to write Nastaliq in the library, or that there was someone from the East who wrote these titles on the side of the books. Another example, it's Maghribi, but it's very interesting to see that this title can be actually very, very ornate and intricate. Then another feature of the book tradition of the period are the beginning of the text. We have the title, and on the next verso, instead of starting with the basmala and then the incipit of the text, we always, or almost always, find these lines with the name of the author, starting with Kala or Yaqulu. And this is very fascinating because it can be like, let's say, an ornate composition here on this manuscript, or a more normal composition here, or a very simple one like this one. And you note that in many instances, the tasliya, which is always present on this point, is written going towards the top of the folio. Same thing on this manuscript, which is also something which has to do with the local tradition. So these elements are important because sometimes it offers the clues to understand very strange items like this one. Well, it looks like an Oriental manuscript. Well, the script is normal, it's But then if you look at the beginning of the text, you see that they follow precisely the Maghrebi way, and that the date at the end of the colophon on the last line is given in Farsi numbers according to this system, which was very popular then. So what we have here is simply a copy in Oriental script written probably in Marrakesh. And what is interesting is that we have also other manuscripts which show that there were Oriental people working for the palace at that time. So Morocco, far from being at the end of the Muslim world, cut from this connection with the high center of culture, was actually really very alive with cultural contacts with the eastern part of the Islamic world. Okay.
Thank you very much, both of you, for this really fascinating material and fascinating presentation. So I suggest that we now open the discussion, and we already have a few questions. The first one is from Olga Bush. Thank you for your fascinating talk. Could you please say a few words about the kinds of manuscripts that are in the collection in addition to the Quran?
Well, I understand I will answer myself. So there are very few Qurans in the collection. Of course, well, I imagine that my current position in the Collège de France is a little bit misleading because, well, I'm teaching Quranic material, but before that, in another life, I was teaching codicology and Arabic manuscripts in the École Pratique. So the Qurans are not at all a topic which is of interest for me in this specific collection. The manuscripts cover all the aspects of Islamic culture. And as I said, in the second part of the book, which we are preparing, there is an analysis by, well, a thematic analysis of the various components of the collection in order to get an insight into what was interesting Saadian readers at that time. Well, princely readers, but anyhow, people who were in connection with the culture of their time. And we have to remember that Aḥmad al-Manṣūr or Moulay Zaidan were themselves having the stature of scholars. They were interested in, and actually we have, as I said, we have notes by Moulay Zaidan on his manuscripts giving opinion. For example, there is one, I don't remember, it's a travelogue, and he say, well, pardon, well, this is shit. Well, it's said with a little more flourish, but still he gives a statement about the value of the text. He is not just collecting bindings to put on the shelves of his library. He is really interested in what, and when you, well, you will read in the book the translation of this, his opinion about this Sharif Hassani, who stole his book. He really is angry, he's furious because the other one dared to take his book from him. And poor man, he had to suffer that again with this time Spanish people taking the library from him.
Thank you. Another question from Christian Mauder. Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. Does the Saadian library feature any evidence for the exchange of books between the courts of Muslim rulers, for example, in the form of books sent as diplomatic gifts?
We don't have this kind of things. We have conversely a suggestion that this may have been the case for Quran sent to Istanbul. We have books which were part of princely collections, but they are, let's say, earlier manuscripts. They were not presented to the Saadian as such.
Thank you. Another question from Evin Kropf. Thank you for this important work and for the fascinating talk. Please, could you comment further on how you have localized the paper to conclude local production rather than imports?
Well,
yeah.
Nuria is...
Yeah, thank you, Evin, for this question. We haven't spoken about paper, but about bindings. And the paper is true that, well, we would have liked to advance more, but we haven't been able to work in the library directly as much as we would have liked. We have found a lot of papers imported, European paper, probably imported from Europe, but at the same time, well, Oriental paper, of course, but for Maghreb manuscripts, paper, well, is, as I found concerning the Iberian Peninsula, paper with zigzag, paper with 4 centimeters far between the chain lines. Well, these kind of papers produced in apparently clearly in Morocco, not imported from European countries. So, but I'm still working with papers, and I will let you know. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from Lila Dao P. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentations. My question is about if the collection is or will be digitized. Also, I heard you speak about digital humanities being part of the project. Does this include full text OCR or other digital humanities work on the collection?
No, in this case, it's well, it's not at all having full reproduction of the manuscript, but more access to full description of the manuscripts and the possibility to have access to pictures showing what we decide, of course, the main features of the manuscript. For the digital collection, this is a matter between the hands of the librarian and the Spanish institution which owns the collection, and I know that they are contemplating this issue.
Thank you. A question from Boris Liebrenz. Thank you. Looking forward to the results of this wonderful project. Where will the catalog data, codicological and paratextual, be published? Is there a database of the manuscript notes?
Currently, no. We will give access to the notes through this digital humanities section, but it's mainly focused on dated material because of course, well, undated material is also important, but owing to the state of studies in codicology and paleography, we feel that it's urgent to provide access to this dated material because it can be compared easily with other things.
Thank you. A question from Akram Habibullah. Is there any work produced by Central Asian intellectuals in the collection?
Well, if you mean texts, yes. If you mean manuscripts, I have a few examples. Of course, as you know, in colophons, usually you don't have the indication of the place where the manuscript was written. But I have a few instances where I would suggest that it's Central Asian material. But of course, it's difficult because sometimes it looks almost like Persian material. It's well, anyhow, it's I didn't mention that, but it's almost entirely Arabic manuscript. We have very few Persian and Turkish, and in the few cases it's not clear whether it was actually part of the Saadian collection or came later into the library by some way.
Thank you. Another question from David Wasserstein. Fascinating talk. Professor de Castilla showed a slide of a passage from the Gazette de France of 1631, mentioning the original manuscript of the works of Augustine. Obviously a legend of some sort, but could she say something about this?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. It's part of the legend. I was showing that concerning bindings, but at the same time we can follow this legend, this story about the richness of the library, of the contents, of the bindings, of the number of volumes. That it's really impressive. So I wanted to show you some specific witnesses of different published in different places or said by different actors, which is very fascinating to know that at that period, that the importance of the collection, even if they needed to make up the story, the contents, and for me, the most important thing was the bindings in this part. But as you say, I haven't found anything about any work of Augustine. I haven't worked in this part. In that part, I don't know if François has something to add, but I think it's it's a little bit part of this legend, of this richness of the collection. But François, I don't know if you have something else.
Yes, well, it's a princely collection, so everybody imagines that it's really impressive, but it's a scholarly collection. And when you look at the books, they are, well, they are used books. You find a lot of books with notes by previous owners. They are not they are not of the highest quality. There are some nice items, of course, but we have a few manuscripts made, copies made for the Saadian, which are really well done. But in most of the cases, what was important was probably more the text, and more than the text, also everything surrounding the text. For example, we have manuscripts with reading or hearing certificates, which are here because these certificates were important. Bashir Tahali has been working on manuscript of the Maqamat of Hariri, and shows how important this manuscript was. And obviously the Saadian were aware, or their middlemen were aware of the value of the manuscript.
Thank you. Mariam Ben Ammar writes, thank you very much for this presentation. Does the collection contain manuscripts of Muslim jurisprudence related to architecture and town planning?
Well, I'm not a specialist of this. Well, there is a kind of bad luck over the section devoted to Muslim jurisprudence, because it was catalogued by Kasiri in the 18th century with his knowledge of the things. But in Derambour's catalogue, jurisprudence was not catalogued. He obviously prepared the notes, and we only have a few descriptions of manuscript of this part of the collection, but it is something which has to be described. And unfortunately, on this topic, I rely on catalogs, and so in this case, on very little.
Thank you. A question from Sumaya Aḥmad. Are there any manuscripts with Thomasic Barber written in Arabic script?
No, we don't have. We perhaps, well, this should be a question for Bashir, because has been looking at that, but we don't have a full text in Tamazight.
Thank you very much. I think we are all very much looking forward to the publication that is hopefully coming out very soon. And I thank you both very much again for having this presentation, and for every participant who has been here today to follow the discussion. And please stay tuned in for future NES events over the course of this academic year. In 2 weeks, we will have Bibliotheca Arabica from Leipzig here, and there will be more things coming up. Thank you very much again. Thank you.